Hey everyone, how are you? We are all the way up to day 11, third week of block 8. All right, it's just both going incredibly fast and incredibly slow from my perspective, but hopefully you are all staying in there, attending office hours, right, on a regular basis, dropping me emails and making sure if you have any questions, you're reaching out and getting in contact with me or other people. So what do we talk about today? Today's actually a relatively short series of lectures. Give you a little bit extra time to make sure you complete homework number 3, which remember is due tomorrow. Okay, so we're talking about chapter 4 here. I'm sorry, chapter 14 on the determinants of the money supply. So on Friday we began talking about the Fed, and that was really the beginning of a week's worth of material here in which we're going to talk about monetary policy. Sorry, someone rang my doorbell. Dog hates the doorman, man. I mean, any of you could walk in my house, and if you didn't ring the doorbell, the dog would just lick you and love you or whatever. But God, he hates the mailman. If the mailman rings the bell, man, that dog wants to kill him. Anyway, that's a little digression. So we're spending this week here talking about monetary policy and Federal Reserve policy and how the Fed impacts financial markets, how the Fed impacts banks, how the Fed responds to financial volatility. So all of that good stuff. And so in chapter 14 is very much about the mechanics of monetary policy. And the same for tomorrow. Chapter 15 is very much about, once again, I'll call it the mechanics of monetary policy. So anyway, we're going to be really working through some more details about how monetary policy works in theory and then how it actually works in practice. So let's begin here and jump into our notes here for chapter 14. So what determines the money supply? That's really what we're going to be talking about here in chapter 14. And how do changes in Fed policy change the money supply? Now, let's remember we talked about this on the second day of class. When I talk about the money supply, I'm really talking about M1, that definition of the money supply, which includes currency in circulation and deposits held by banks. Now, you'll notice here that if we're going to understand M1, if we're going to understand the money supply, we have to understand what the Fed is doing, because the Fed controls currency and it also regulates banks, so it impacts deposits. But we also have to understand how banks work, because banks also play a role in determining the amount of deposits within an economy. And so banks play an important role in generating M1. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about here in chapter 14 is how does Fed policy impact banks, and what's the interplay there that helps us understand the money supply. Now, to understand the money supply better, let's begin by talking about the Fed's balance sheet. Okay, the Fed's balance sheet. Just like a bank has a balance sheet, the Fed has a balance sheet. And it has liabilities, meaning sources of funds, and it has assets or uses of funds. The unusual thing about the Fed is that the Fed can make up liabilities as they want, right? The Fed's two liabilities are currency and reserves, right? Reserves in the banking system. The incredible thing about being the Fed is that the Fed can make these out of thin air. The Fed can print more currency whenever it wants. The Fed can create electronic reserves whenever it wants. So the Fed, it has this, incredible power to create liabilities. It can create currency and it can create reserves. It can then use those liabilities to purchase assets. And the two big assets that the Federal Reserve purchases are securities, meaning treasury bills usually. But the Fed, as we talk about, has also purchased other sort of securities like treasury bonds or mortgage-backed securities or other assets. And then the Fed could also make loans to banks. And this is what we call discount lending, right? Discount loans. This is in the Fed's role of being lender of last resort. So if the Fed feels that a bank needs a loan, it's short of liquidity, it's not in danger of failing, but it's just short, and it has a temporary problem or short-term shortfall in liquidity, the Fed can make it a loan. So the Fed can create its own liabilities, currency, and reserves, and then it can use that to buy any sort of assets, right? Mainly securities such as bonds, different sorts of bonds, and then loans to financial institutions. So that's what the Fed's balance sheet looks like. Now, let's talk about these two definitions of money that we're going to be using here. M1, as we've talked about, M1 is currency plus reserves, C plus D. But as I mentioned before, the Fed doesn't perfectly control this. Banks play a role in determining what deposits are. So the Fed does not perfectly control the M1. What does the Fed control? Well, if you go back to this balance sheet, the Fed controls its liabilities, currency and reserves. And we call that the monetary base, okay? MB is the monetary base. It's currency plus reserves. And you can think about the monetary base as the part of the money supply that the Fed does control. So while the Fed doesn't control M1 perfectly, it does control the monetary base. The Fed can then use its power over the monetary base to influence M1. And we're going to talk about how that works here in this chapter. All right. So once again, understanding this distinction is absolutely crucial to everything that we talk about here this morning, right? Or whenever you're watching this lecture. That M1 is the money supply, but the Fed doesn't perfectly control the money supply. It only controls the monetary base, meaning currency plus reserves. How does the Fed change the monetary base? These are really, what tools does the Fed have to change the monetary base? And in reality, the Fed has three, well, really two basic tools, right? Two basic tools that we're going to talk about. The first, and the one that the Fed uses far and away the most, is open market operations, right? Open market operations meaning the Fed can buy and sell T-bills, okay? And in doing that, they can increase the amount of liabilities they have, or they can decrease the amount of liabilities. They can increase the monetary base, they can decrease the monetary base. So let's look at an example here, all right? Let's consider an open market purchase. So the Fed decides that they want to conduct a purchase of $100. First off, how does that impact the Federal Reserve balance sheet? And then how does that impact the banking system? If the Fed is going to buy $100 of T-bills, they first have to create either $100 of reserves or $100 in currency. Which is it? Well, that really depends upon what the bank wants. The bank could request the money in reserves, or the bank could request the money in currency. Either way, the Fed's liabilities go up by 100 million. And also its assets go up by 100 million. What's happened to the monetary base here? It's gone up by 100 billion because the amount of currency or the amount of reserves have gone up by 100 million. So here the Fed has increased the monetary base. What's happened over here in the banking system? So the Fed bought these bonds from banks. The banks now have $100 million less in securities because they've sold those securities to the Fed. What do the banks get in return? They either get 100 million in reserves or they get 100 million in currency, depending upon what they want. The key here is that when the Fed conducts an open market purchase of 100 million, they change the monetary base by 100 million. However, the Fed doesn't actually control how much of it is held as currency and how much is held reserves. So in other words, the Fed's going to see its liabilities go up by 100 million, but what exactly those liabilities are, what form they take, we don't know. How about if the Fed conducts an open market sale? Well, here it's just the exact opposite. Here, during an open market sale, the monetary base would go down by 100 million, right? So the Fed would take, in this case, if it's currency, the Fed would take 100 million in currency out of circulation, and they would do that by selling $100 million in T-bills. So they sell the T-bills, in return they get currency, and they take that out of circulation. What happens in the banking system? The banking system has 100 million less in currency and 100 million more in securities. So notice here that banks have become less liquid. When the Fed conducts an open market sale, the Fed has made the banking system less liquid, right? Less liquid. There's less cash and close to cash assets out there in the banking system. What happens to the monetary base if you write your roommate a check? Nothing, right? This whole process is started when the Fed creates new currency or new reserves. So if you just write your roommate a check, it's money that comes out of your bank and goes into another bank, right? There's no net change in the monetary base and no net change in the money supply. It's only when the Fed does this. So that's one way that the Fed could change the monetary base. The other way that the Fed could change the monetary base is through discount lending. And discount lending looks almost the same, except instead of buying a bond or selling a bond, here you're buying a loan from a bank, right? So let's consider an example where the Fed makes a discount loan to the bank of $100 million. Once again, and let's assume that the bank wants this money in reserves. What happened to the Fed balance sheet? Its liabilities go up by 100 million, and now the Fed has a loan out there to the bank, and that loan is an asset from the Fed's perspective because it's lent money out. What about the banking system? Now the banking system has $100 million in reserves. That's an asset because the Fed created these for the banks. But now they have a liability that they've borrowed $100 million from the bank, from the Fed. Notice here, and maybe I should have mentioned this point earlier, when the Fed conducts an open market sale or when the Fed conducts a discount loan, they haven't changed the net worth of the bank. You know, liabilities and assets change by the same amount. So there's no new net wealth creation. All the Fed has done is change the liquidity of the banking system. In this case, the Fed has added more liquidity because they've given this bank a loan and now the bank has reserves, right? So once again, to summarize, using open market operations or discount loans, the Fed has good control over the monetary base, but they don't have control over how much of that monetary base is in reserves or in currency, right? That's really determined by the bank, whether they want to take the money in reserves or whether they want to take it in currency. Okay, let's take a break here, and then I want to come back and talk about what happens once the Fed changes the monetary base. How does a change in the monetary base translate into a change in the money supply? Right, back in a moment.